Well, hello, class, and welcome to week 13. Can you believe that we have made it this far? We only have 2 weeks of class left, and I just want to congratulate y'all on your perseverance and your hard work thus far. And I'm very confident that y'all will complete the rest of this semester with as much fervor and excitement as you guys have done the first 12 weeks. So, we are going to talk about a couple different things during this lecture. Some of it is taken from the text that we talked about or that we read from this week. There's little parts where I put my own spin on it. And then, of course, I'll give you all a resource and we'll talk about what the final week of class is going to look like. Now, I know in weeks past when we've had a group discussion board from the Clinton text, we've actually spent a lot of time delving into what that question is in talking about it in our lecture. But I didn't actually want to do that this week too much because I feel like y'all are getting such a good grasp of the difference between Christian and non-Christian counseling, but really kind of the beautiful pairing that it offers and how applicable it is to be able to use Christian interventions in a non-Christian setting. We've talked so much about that kind of that umbrella of all truth is God's truth. And when we work from that foundation, it's very, very easy to be able to kind of pull from a plethora of different resources and avenues to reach Christians and non-Christians alike in very effective ways. And so you guys, as I look at from the beginning of the class until this point, I've just watched y'all grow so much and just kind of that expansion and that awareness. What does it actually look like? All truth is God's truth. And so I'm very excited about that. And because you guys have latched onto that concept so well, I don't really feel the need to belabor that point. But of course, like the question asks, how can we use that truth model with a non-Christian? And when we kind of place that under that umbrella that we've talked about, all truth is God's truth, you can see very, very easily that it's very applicable to use that with a Christian or non-Christian alike. Now, we'll say one thing with the truth model, and as you found out through the Clinton text, most of their approaches are going to be fairly cognitive behavioral. As I've found going through graduate school and even counseling myself, talking with many pastors and other professionals, I have found that most Christian counseling tends to take a cognitive behavioral approach. There is nothing wrong with that. That just is an approach or a treatment model that seems to fit very well within spirituality. That doesn't mean that you can't take from other approaches. That doesn't mean that in a non-Christian setting, you couldn't take some of that cognitive behavioral approach from a Christian counseling setting and move it into your non-Christian counseling setting. I just kind of wanted to make that as a note that most of the time, Christian counseling interventions, as you can see in the Clinton text, do have that cognitive behavioral spin to them. And that's just what it is. Cognitive behavioral is very, very well known. It's well recognized. It can be very effective. When I did my work with sex offenders, we used almost an exclusively cognitive behavioral approach. It was very, very effective. The approach that we took led to a very, very low recidivism rate. And so you can see that cognitive behavioral, whether working with sex offenders or any other person or in a Christian or non-Christian setting, can be very effective. So that's really all I'm going to say about that. And I'm actually going to kind of jump into the Ivy text this week. We are in chapter 13. And there was just kind of a couple different aspects that I wanted to hit on for y'all. The first one being psychoeducation. We really have not spent a lot of time on psychoeducation. And so really briefly, and I know there was a PowerPoint, and so some of this might feel a little bit redundant, but of course I'm going to put my own spin on it. But essentially the basic definition of psychoeducation is education of the process of psychology or education of the process of counseling. And really a little bit of psychoed, especially at the beginning of counseling, is very, very appropriate. I think about different theories that I use within treatment. I use internal family systems, or IFS, a lot. It's a kind of a derivative from family systems. There's a very psychoeducational piece that I use with every single client that I use this model on, because it's very important to understand what the different terminology is. IFS is like a systems approach, and where it talks about homeostasis, but instead of family members, we talk about parts. And so it's very appropriate to use psychoeducation psychoeducation when educating the client about this approach, about the different parts, what they mean, what they represent. Psychoeducation, you need that. EFT, which is an approach that y'all have heard me talk about many times before, emotions-focused therapy. Psychoeducation is used in that, even though there's much more of a systemic and experiential flair to it. Psychoeducation is actually used uniquely in this process when you've had a really deep moment with a client, or usually it's two clients, and you're not quite sure where to go, and you're kind of tracking, but you want to make sure that you're on the same page as them, or in order to refocus where you guys are going, kind of coming up a level and doing some psychoeducation to kind of refocus can be very, very important. So that's another way that you might use psychoeducation. I use psychoeducation a lot when I work with trauma clients. There's two specific models of therapy that I would use with trauma clients. One I'm trained in, and the other one I'm not trained in, so I just use parts of it. One of them being TFCBT, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is something I'm certified in, or then EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Both of those are specifically to work with clients who have undergone trauma. Of course, we know trauma is subjective, so really any client could do this. But there's very much a psychoeducational piece as you give the client kind of direction and a little bit of control. When the client knows, hey, this is where we're going, they're able to feel a little bit of control over the process. And so this is a really great way for a client to understand, to feel like they have control of the process, they know where they're going, and it can alleviate a little bit of stress. Wonderful way to use psychoeducation. And the other way that I was thinking, psychoeducation can be used when you're using any sort of new micro skill or treatment intervention, say like mindfulness. A client might not know not mindfulness, meditation. Well, they might not know what mindfulness is either. But think about if you're introducing meditation to a client and they've never experienced that before. There would be an element of psychoeducation that you would want to use in order to explain that to them. You would want to use that in order to help them walk through what a meditation is. So psychoeducation can be used for multiple purposes, and I think it's very appropriate to use it with every single client at some point in their counseling experience. This is very much a teaching approach. But the one caution that I would urge you to consider is to be very careful when using psychoeducation, because you're going to want to limit it to an extent. Psychoeducation on one end of the spectrum could really kind of aid a client in depending on you for the answers and the next step, rather than them seeking themselves, or kind of the answers or the process or the journey themselves. What I mean is, if we rely too heavily on psychoeducation, we're teaching the client rather than them doing that inward soul searching or reaching out to God through prayer and through journaling and other mediums, so that they're really kind of owning this process. So you do want to be very careful. And the other piece of psychoeducation is that when you are using that within a session, you're always going to want to make sure to check in with the client throughout kind of your teaching, but also for sure at the end, you're going to want to make sure to check in with them. And the reason why is you want to make sure always that they're understanding it, that they have permission to ask questions or ask for clarifications. This is a way for you to make sure that they're tracking with you, that they can know fully the direction that you're going and why you would find it important to use whatever it is that you're using with them. So you're always going to want to make sure to check in with the client, and that really could be as simple as, tell me what you heard from what I said, or based off of what I said, what are your thoughts? Do you have any questions? Do you agree with this? Do you disagree with this? What do you see that might be beneficial from what I said in implementing into our treatment plan? So that's part of that check-in process. Of course, you're keeping the client engaged. You're keeping them engaged in the process, as well as engaged with themselves and engaged with you. So that's a little bit about psychoeducation. We'll pause the video here and then we'll move on to a couple other areas.